Here waiting for you. So.
All right. It is setting up to go on live. Okay. It's done, Linda. All right. It is setting up to go on live. Okay. Okay. It's done, Linda. All right. It is setting up to go on live. Okay. I'm not sure if that's coming from me. It's done, Linda. All right. It is setting up to go online. Okay. I'm not sure if that's coming from me.
Mute yourself, Gabby.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's coming.
So mute your
mute which one?
Mute your YouTube. Just mute the YouTube.
Okay. Where is it?
So mute your
mute which one?
Mute your YouTube. Just mute the YouTube.
I know. Where do I find it? Where is it? Oh, here we go.
Okay. Now you should be okay.
I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay. All right. I apologize for all of that. I hope that what you're seeing on the screen is a slide that introduces our presentation today. Lore, will you give me a thumbs up if that's it? I just want to make sure that we're on. Okay, thank you. All right. Buenas tardes. Thanks for joining us today. We are grateful for your presence. We will be recording this talk so that we may share it via our YouTube channel, as you already saw. If you wish to turn off your camera, please do so at the moment. I am Dr. Gabriela Baeza Ventura, Associate Professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies, Executive Editor at Arte Público Press, and co-founder of U.S. Latino Digital Humanities program at the University of Houston. On behalf of Arte Público Press, Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project, U.S. Latino Digital Humanities, we welcome you to our first event of 2021. As many of you know, Arte Público Press and Recovery, two important forces in the field of U.S. Latino studies, were funded and are directed by Dr. Nicolás Canelos. His vision to establish the nonprofit press and the historical archival program stemmed from a social justice need to document the legacy of Latina and Latino culture, language, and literature in the United States. To date, Arte Público Press has published over 600 books, fiction, nonfiction, including YA and children's literature, and Recovery has located over 1,400 newspapers and digitized thousands of records that document the presence of the Latina and Latino people in the land that we know as the United States. The social justice need continues to this day as we fight against the erasure of our bodies and language on a daily basis. Therefore, the need to create a program that could use these resources for digital scholarship was and is imminent. My colleague, Dr. Carolina Villarroel, Brown Foundation Director of Research and Recovery at the Recovery, and I began the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities program a few years ago with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who are sponsoring this talk. Special thanks to Patricia Shui for her guidance and support as well. And we are happy to report that we have made important strides in this field. We have grown our team to include Dr. Lorena Gothero and Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant. And together we organize talks and workshops on digital humanities and social justice, present at conferences across the United States and abroad, train and mentor students from all academic levels, as well as community members on U.S. Latino digital humanities practice. We create digital projects and data sets as well, with the help recently of Dr. Paige Morgan. We also recently awarded the first 7 grants of U.S. Latino digital humanities projects, over $50,000, and provided training to the first cohort. We are looking to fund the next set, so we invite you to submit your application. All this work has solidified USLEH into a program that continues to work on the US Latino written legacy that has been lost, absent, repressed, and or underrepresented. I invite you to visit our website, artepublicopress.com, for more information, to follow us on social media, and to use the hashtag USLDH to live tweet our lectures and to tweet at us and about US Latino digital humanities. And of course, if you can, please donate to Arte Publico Press, because the more books that we print and sell, the more books that we get to publish, the more people that we get to help. Now my colleague, Dr. Gothero, will introduce our distinguished guest today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I introduce Dr. Morgan, I would like to go over a few logistics for the Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat function to type in your questions. After the lecture, I will share your questions with Dr. Morgan so that she can answer them. Lastly, please mute yourselves to cut down on background noise. Now allow me to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Paige Morgan is the Digital Publishing and Copyright Librarian and Head of Digital Scholarship and Publishing Services at the University of Delaware Library, Museums, and Press. She has previously worked at the University of Miami Libraries as Digital Scholarship Librarian and Scholarly Publishing Officer, as well as a CLEAR postdoctoral fellow at the Lewis and Ruth Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship at Master University. In the past 10 years, Dr. Morgan has worked within the field of digital humanities in several capacities, as a researcher, instructor, data wrangler, and community/curriculum builder. You can find her writing at DHN Lib, Archive Journal, Romanticism, and in college and undergraduate libraries. The title of her talk is Building Collectivity in Digital Humanities Through Working with Data. Take it away, Paige.
Okay, man, special guest appearance by my cat, who has figured out, I think, that there is somewhere else she would rather be. I'm gonna just share my screen. Let's see. So can everyone see this? Yes, all right, let's get into this. So to start, I do want to say a little bit about the title, because I think at least one person thought, oh, Paige is going to do some sort of data analysis based on projects that are out there to assess how collective we are or aren't being. And I get that interpretation. Indeed, though, it's not what I'm going to do. I'm really positioning this in terms of thinking about how we work with our data. And by data, I mean a whole range of materials and evidence that we look at and analyze and treasure and read, and that we work with in digital contexts. I could have called this alternately Building Collectivity in Digital Humanities by rethinking how we publish our materials. And I want to note that in this talk, I'm going to be trying to talk both to digital humanists who build programs and support systems at institutions, and digital humanists who build research and draw lines or bridges between them in what I'm exploring, because I think what I'm about to say today and discuss really does involve both groups. So one thing I need to make clear is sort of the foundation of where I'm starting from in this talk. And that foundation is that we are all very, very, very tired. Not only tired, but frightened, depressed, dealing with a lack of support for education for kids, dealing with lost jobs, lost income. And I know we all know this, but I don't think that it is in any way appropriate to try and talk about digital humanities or doing anything in digital humanities without acknowledging where we are and that level of exhaustion as a starting point. And in thinking about this, the pandemic obviously is the motivation for my taking that stance. And yet, I'm not sure that it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to take that stance even were there no pandemic, even were we all getting ready to go to our superb owl or Super Bowl parties, depending on your perspective. Because over the past, I don't know, 10 years, as I've watched programs getting built and folks pursuing grants and getting them and offering fellowships for students, developing courses, it still feels a lot of the time like we're often holding it together with chewing gum and coffee and invisible and precarious labor, motivated to put the best and most positive spin on it that we can by the capitalist logic that kind of runs through and under getting that funding in many cases and keeping our programs running. And the nature of university budgets really pushes us to use overly positive language to emphasize our achievements in order to get more money. But in doing so, I think it's easy to end up suppressing certain realities in order to suggest that we're being productive. I say that and then say, as an aside, how grateful I am to be here, how grateful I am that funders like the Mellon program exist to provide alternatives to this. But in a lot of cases, there's that chewing gum and invisible labor and hope labor. The idea that if we do some cases, that's true. We learn, we figure it out. We develop new workflows, new positions. But there's also the danger sometimes that doing something over and over again doesn't make it sustainable. It just normalizes overworking. This can happen for all sorts of reasons. And it's also that digital humanities, although people can talk about the long history with Roberto Busa and how long it's been going, in a lot of ways, the current wave is still really new. We're still figuring it out. We're making digital humanities as amazing as it can be. And then sometimes it's less perfect than we would hope. That happens for all sorts of reasons because of overloaded work schedules, glitchy data, someone left the project, someone new came on, the documentation was spotty, so we ended up with glitchy data. There were unexpected changes in the software. I could go on, but I'm not listing all of these to tell you that what we really have to do is to make sure that it's perfect in the future, because that would be monstrous and also impossible. So digital humanities scholarship and projects ends up being imperfect, but we do our best to make it good enough. But good enough for what is the question? And I say this because I think that we as a community, and I'm speaking very, very broadly and including practitioners and infrastructure builders, libraries, centers, have learned to think about digital humanities or digital scholarship, depending on what you want to call it, from what I would call an additive standpoint, i.e. we need this, plus that other thing, and then we'll be successful. I want to note that I've certainly thought of it this way. I think it's pretty natural to do so when you're program building and trying to plan effectively. And it can be really important, but it tends to focus on the question of what else do we need? Oh, well, if we only had this other thing too, then we'd be able to achieve our truest aspirations. And to make it clear, I'm not trying to criticize us for thinking about digital humanities this way. There are tons and tons of structural components that encourage it. The challenge, I would say, is that this sort of thinking drives us towards always feeling like we don't have enough, like we always need more. And to be fair, I get it. Particularly in an age of defunding, this is an entirely understandable perspective. And yet, I still think it's worth being aware of how this additive thinking shapes digital humanities in part because I think it tends to emphasize scarcity, competition for resources, whether grants or fellowships, and individualism, whether the individual is a person or an institution. This sort of thinking has been shaped by the very individualistic nature of the academy. Well, I get that job, that grant, that publication, that fellowship. This is especially true in the humanities, but I'd argue that it persists in the sciences even when we have co-authors. I make this as an observation, not a calling out. I would argue that this sort of individualistic logic has shaped digital scholarship and digital humanities both, including the genres of projects that we produce, the processes and norms that we follow. One of those biggest norms is that a project is meant to advance your CV, your research agenda, your career. And I want to say that I think we tend towards this additive stance even as many folks in the field take careful and deliberate action to be more aware and make all of us more aware of the ingrained white supremacy within our discipline and take steps to make our discipline more equitable in a variety of ways. I think this is true even as we increase our attention to the risks of reinforcing bias when we work with data about underrepresented or minoritized populations. I say additive because it's the word that captures the sense that I've experienced and that I think many people have experienced. And I also want to draw a connecting line between the term additive and terms like extractive and consumptive, used among others by Dr. Yves Tuck and by Dr. Max Liboireau to describe reading methods, particularly reading Indigenous scholarship, while driven by the driving question of what do I get out of this? What is here for me? And as they've both noted in various places, talks, scholarship, tweet threads, a lot of academic culture encourages us to be extractive and consumptive about all sorts of scholarship. It's just a particular problem around white people reading Indigenous scholarship. The connection that I see here with DH is in the push towards achievements that look like particularly quantifiable progress. We got a grant, we offered fellowships, we built a project website, and all of these can be genuine successes. But the reason that you hear me being cautious or sounding even slightly suspicious about these achievements is that they're often intensely focused on one end product. I even say in kind of a monolithic fashion. Succeeding at any of those, grant, project, website, etc., almost certainly includes a whole bunch of other sorts of achievements that are under the hood, as it were. Maybe it's developing workflows for processing objects by different groups of people with different expertise. Maybe it's a whole set of agreements that had to be worked out between the library and IT. Those are just a couple of examples. There are tons more. It's really easy for those other aspects of the work, whatever the end product of it is, to be minimized or forgotten because they're not press release worthy, or as some would probably say, they're not sufficiently Dean candy enough to catch the administration's eye. And we want the administration to be thinking about that successful end product. And I get that, I really do. I think that the danger when these parts are forgotten is that the deans or the other administrators, anyone high up, or even someone who's coming to DH as a researcher who has a vision of a project, an idea for one, can forget that this is the work that the project is built on. And so I say that digital scholarship is always at risk of or under pressure to be additive or extractive. This is what I mean. Another place where I see this sort of what I'm calling an additive nature of digital scholarship in action is in the tendency to always want to build more new projects rather than finding ways to engage with the ones that we've built. though there are changes in this area, most especially Jen Giuliano and Rupika Risam's journal project Reviews in DH, now in its second year, which responds to those to concerns like those raised by Roxanne Shirazi in noting the absence of digital project critique. And I want to make it clear that I see, and I think Roxanne similarly, does not see this just as figuring out which projects are worthy and which ones are not. It's that without engagement for really reading digital projects and working with them, I think that DH projects become sort of quantitative achievements meant to show the success of this program, this initiative, so that we can get more funding, so that we can say that we are preparing our grad students to be ready for the job market because they're DHers, so they'll be ready. And this feels to me like a problem that I don't see just going away on its own, even if the budget realities change as the vaccine rolls out, etc. I don't see these going away, this problem going away on its own, unless we find a way to engage with projects differently. And I want to note that I've mentioned extractive reading, but we could also talk about extractive labor from students and staff especially, but certainly not excluding faculty. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about sustainability, especially because I think it's a really good example of digital humanities tending toward the additive, the extractive, but that could be more moving towards what I'll call a more collective digital humanities. And I want to illustrate what I mean by that. And I want to be clear, though I'm going to sketch out a direction, I don't think that any one person can fully define it. I see myself as just starting what I hope could be a very expansive list. So, sustainability. There have been a few different approaches to sustainability in digital humanities over the last several years. Rob and Camille Davis has looked at projects presented at early DH conferences and noted how many of them were still around and functioning a few years later. Spoiler, not many. There's the really excellent socio-technical sustainability roadmap, which is designed to help project groups think through questions around sustainability and sort of working to build a bridge between DH project folks and standards for preservation like those created by the NDSA. And I've seen lots and lots of efforts to preserve projects in Docker containers or on other emulators. Think here of the Internet Archive, that try as faithfully as possible to recreate or maintain the environments that projects were built in or released in whenever they were first published. And I want to note, I have friends and colleagues who have worked hard on these projects and whose work I respect and admire tremendously. And I want to come at these projects, particularly the Docker container, let's preserve this in the way that in its original format, with a thoughtful and critical eye, because I would argue that this too is a more additive approach to sustainability than a collective one. Let me unpack this a little bit further. I think, in part, that the emphasis on preserving websites and their original functionality comes from the fact that the website can feel like the most tangible and distinct proof that, oh my gosh, I actually accomplished the thing that I thought I was going to set out and build. We've got to save that. And if it's not around anymore, then man, is that line on my CV even worth anything? Are people going to believe me? I get that feeling. I really, really do. I also think that Dorothea Salo is onto something when she argues that humanists are still overly attached to and working under the hegemony of the idea of the printed text. That is, we're used to print monograph type things and the culture around them being available in libraries for us to check out. And a detailed and functional website seems like the closest equivalent to a printed book. It's the form that the scholarship took. The details are important. Surely it should be preserved in that form. Well, I agree, it should be preserved. But in what form? Because if we think of sustainability purely or even mostly from a technical perspective, which is what I would argue the can we save it in a Docker container approach does, then I think that really pushes us towards how do we save this website? And that creates a whole set of technical barriers because not everyone has the tools to save this website. But also saving the website is one thing, but that doesn't actually make the ideas or the scholarly arguments that went into the website sustainable in themselves. I want to note that I tweeted a little bit about this in December, and Quinn Dombrowski put it really, really well, way better than I did, go Quinn, in summing up my thread about it by saying, I want to approach this less as make my thing available as is for longer and more to making things usable in more ways by more people. And so to illustrate what I'm thinking about when I suggest this is that for any project, there is material, I'll call it data, that went into it. Maybe that data is textual. Maybe it's metadata, controlled vocabularies that you created. Maybe it's images or sound files. That's all of which could be said to make up one or more data sets. Maybe there are processing workflows that were used. Each of those separate components could be licensed for reuse, meaning giving people explicit permission to use them, maybe modify them, maybe not, and deposited in repositories that say, here, this is available for people to work with. And that doing that, taking those artifacts, those workflows, and releasing them could very well be a more sustainable version of a project than making the early 2000s website still function. Because if people can go to a version of the early 2000s website and navigate it the way that they always could, yeah, that's valuable, that's one thing. But what if they can make use of your original data set in their own project? What if they can build on it? What if they can say, man, this controlled vocabulary for classifying Victorian genres of antimacassars, that's a ridiculous idea, was based on this scholarship. It's great, but since then we have new scholarship, and so I am modifying this controlled vocabulary and using it in my project. And then your project stays alive, goes on, becoming part of new projects. Your data goes on, your workflows go on. And that's, I would say, potentially much more powerful in some ways than hanging on to that website. It does require thinking carefully and critically. So Matt Lincoln, also that same day, noted, and he has a really wonderful thread about this that I will retweet at the end of this talk, that it really does require thinking critically about how do you make something reusable and what parts are reusable? Because some aspects of any given project might be built with fairly customized code made to work in a very particular environment. I will note that I am the person who has compared the internet not to Shakespeare's stage, but to a Jenga game of constantly changing infrastructure. So maybe not all of your project is reusable, but maybe your data model is. I will also note that when I say make it available, release it, and license it, I don't mean just drop it into a GitHub repository and say, whoop, I made it public, there we go. Doing this work well means providing contextual documents that explain the rationale for how a corpus was assembled, what scholarship a controlled vocabulary was based on, what critical decisions shaped whatever is being released. So there is a lot of work that could happen here. And depending on the project, I think that work might be just as valuable as the work of figuring out how to make the project, make the website in its original form keep on going. The other dimension that I want to bring before you today comes from the work of Dr. Max Libraron, who I mentioned earlier. Libraron works in the sciences currently as the director for the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research, or CLEAR. CLEAR describes itself as a feminist, anti-colonial marine science laboratory, meaning that their methods, in their own words, foreground values of humility, equity, and good land relations. And the CLEAR Lab is worth your attention, really, Google them, look them up. But I mention it here mainly to give you a sense of the work that Dr. Libraron is leading and is part of. They have also worked in art and exhibit curation as well, focusing on a number of exhibitions that invite viewers to peruse exhibits and make exchanges of a range of different types of objects, including trash and art, and under different conditions or rules of exchange. And you can read about these in Libraron's essay in the collection Transmissions, Critical Tactics for Making and Communicating Research. The research question motivating these exhibits, in their own words, is what modes of valuation, besides those recognized by capitalism, are already among us? And I'll slow down here just to let this question breathe, as it were, because I think that this is a really expansive question, one that has relevance well beyond the formal workplace or disciplinary bounds that you might be thinking of right now, since I've been talking about digital humanities. I do hope that you'll think about this question in that larger scope. I know that I am. For now, though, I'm going to bring things back to this question within a digital humanities context, and I want to alter the question just a little. If the citation on this looks weird, crediting myself alongside Dr. Libraron, I want to tell you that I'm doing that in part as part of an agreed upon exchange. And to understand, you'll just need to go and look up that essay. But my altered question, what modes of valuation, besides those recognized by capitalism, are already or could be among us? I make this alteration because I'm trying to think about both what's there already and what could be within the scope of digital humanities and the projects we build and the projects we read and engage with. And to be clear, I'm only one person with only one set of experiences, and undoubtedly all of you will have your own as well. Earlier in this talk, I was suggesting some of the ways in which I see DH as structurally pressured to be additive in ways that basically align well with capitalism and power hierarchies. Certainly, too, I have stories that are much different, that are based around altruism, consideration, and mutual aid and interest. And indeed, for all that Twitter can be a cesspool of nastiness, I actually think that the lack of stature that we give tweets and tweeting can, at other times, actually contribute to alternative and non-capitalistic forms of valuation. I am not so sure, however, that our current structures and rituals around DH publication are as supportive of alternative methods of valuation, which is not to condemn them outright. They are a work in progress. They are what we make of them now, next week, next month, next year. I want to note, too, that what I'm trying to create space for in engaging with Libéron's question goes beyond, in my mind, a simple thing like, oh, everyone should release the components of their DH work and make them free. Won't that be great? Because I don't think it's ever that simple. That's just saying that everyone should make their work consumable for and by the rest of us. Similarly, there are risks in going down these lines of making this too transactional, i.e., I use your project, I cite you, we're done, and eventually you can get the impact factor of your research. Isn't that great? Aren't you excited to have the value of your research quantifiably established? The temptation to say, oh, just do this thing across the board is part of the challenge. And the challenge that I am asking us to take up and thinking, what do we do with our projects? How do we make them engage with other people's projects? How do we make them open for other people to engage with us in a variety of ways? And I will note that it feels to me like a particular challenge for us to do this well, because, as I noted earlier in this talk, we're so tired. And our administrators are so tired. And frankly, generous thinking, which I think is called for here, can be pretty hard under conditions of extreme exhaustion and stress. Instead, though, I think what's called for is careful thinking. Libéron makes a point of asking readers of their article to think actively about what the ideal exchange between author and reader could be. And I feel strongly that something similar is called for when we think about DH projects, and that thinking about the answer to that question can and should, in many cases, influence how we put those projects out into the world, whether we call it publishing or something else. It is more, I would say, than quoting, though I think it could be exciting to think about how do you quote data? How do you quote a data set? It could be about environmental scans that are about more than proving that a new project isn't simply duplicative, which again tends back towards that individual, I am doing something new here. It could be more focused on what interoperability could be. It's important to note that not everything that I think is implied here is necessarily big, because the bigger that an intervention is, the harder it is to sustain. The more tendency there is to say, oh, well, just make it work. I know it's hard. I know you're overloaded, but just make it happen because we'll be successful and then things will get better. And that tends back towards that extractive mode. To close, I want to highlight one more recent piece of scholarship, though it defied me in trying to find a good quote for it, but I'll tweet it out. It's called The Transformative Power of Values Enacted Scholarship, and it's written by Nikki Agate, Rebecca Kennison, and a whole bunch of other people, many of whom may be familiar to you. And it has tremendous things to say, again, defying easy summarization, but I will paraphrase part of its thrust as asking where in the processes of creating scholarship can our values be enacted? Often, I think it's easy to rush into locating our values in the topic of study, which is important. But our values can come into play in so many other aspects of the process from start to finish, whether you as a student or new researcher are thinking about what your project will do or be, how big it will be, or whether you are a librarian who is working on building support so that people can build these projects. There are so many places I would where those values can be enacted. I would love to hear from all of you where they are, because I think they happen before and after the moment of, or moments of publication. So on that note, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Paige. We really appreciate it. I know we're already kind of short on time, so I am going to open up questions. I don't want to keep you too long. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and we'll get to them. I see some people were discussing the idea of sustainability, and there was a little kind of brainstorming as to where we can maintain these things. So I'm going to kind of try to put them together. How do we reconcile site creation opportunities like Wix, Instagram, Facebook with little or no migration archiving capacity? Thinking about website in 2021 is finite. It's a kind of finite approach to what we're creating now. And then also, I know a couple of people mentioned, can we think about sharing on sharing our research, publishing, making available on things like peer-reviewed journals?
So those are great possibilities, and I think that often sometimes we underestimate the potential for I'm going to run with that controlled vocabulary example. We underestimate the possibility for creating it to be a peer-reviewed article. I will also note that there are various sites, and I know that some of you are familiar with these. The one that maybe most of you are familiar with would be the MLA Commons Core repository, which is really designed for sharing not just presentations and open access versions of articles, but for sharing data sets or snippets of code to make them discoverable. And I say this in part because one of the hats I wear is as a copyright librarian. And I run into researchers on a regular basis who are like, am I allowed to use this? And the value of putting material into repositories like that, like MLA Core or Dataverse, is that when you do that, you are given the opportunity to explicitly license and explicitly give people permission and say, yes, you can use this under these terms. So I hope that kind of starts at answering this question.
Okay, so another question we had, and this is a two-parter from different people. So what does collectivity look like? And this is the follow-up. What do you mean by collective sustainability specifically? If you're far along with that thinking yet.
Right, I see those from Marta and Scott. Thank you both. I would say that collectivity in this case might mean using or deliberately reusing and building on released parts of projects. So you build a project, you released it in 2014. You kept the website up for a couple of years, and then you release the data set on MLA Core. Someone else interested in a similar project is like, oh, here's a data set that I can use. They engage with your project because I'm imagining that you've explained where the data set came from, how it was created, and then they build on it, adding their own ideas in. It becomes part of another project and is then potentially reused and released itself. And I want to note, again, I'm trying to think expansively and not define this fully. I would say that if I made a point during the talk about preserving whether your website was sustainable versus your ideas being sustainable. To me, if your project evidence and data has a life within your project, has a life within multiple other people's projects, to me, that is a part of collective sustainability. That's a big, big part of it. Scott, you might be able to take it even further, but I think that sort of action, and I want to make it clear too, that this should not just be, oh, I'm going to plug in, here's some data I can grab and I can plug into my project. That pushes us back towards that same sort of extractivity. Here's data that I should use. Whereas instead, and this is, I think, good from a critical thinking and critical intellectual perspective too, if you're using someone's data about women's work in the 1940s, then you're actually spending time looking at that data and thinking about where does it represent the scholarly arguments that I see happening. So to me, that is a different type of sustainability than preserving the website. I hope that helps make this clear.
Paige, I see a question from Hannah, and I actually want to piggyback on that just because I did really love the way in which you push us to think outside of the capitalistic box, right? Capitalism definitely tries to make us not see any other forms of value. It's hard for us to even think of other forms of value. So because of that structure and our way of thinking, Hannah points to the fact that if we try to move away from that, is it really easy? It's so easy to use that framework to also justify labor exploitation, right? Because we're so stuck in this framework of capitalism. We'll end up, in other words, publishing for free, but we'll publish this for free, we won't pay you, we'll use your labor, grad student labor, right? But not pay you in any way. So how do we get around this?
That's a really good question. And I say it thinking of that story that's been going around Twitter from the past week of a student discovering that the professor who made the lectures for his class had died a few years earlier. Because there is a dark and unpleasant version of this in which it's like, woo, we're still using your stuff after you're gone. There are a couple of things I want to say. That one, in part, what I'm drawing on are structures that are already in place through many funders, stipulating that when they fund your project, you need to make the materials from the project openly available. That's more common in the sciences than in the humanities, but it's no less true. And so part of what I'm saying is that, oh, and you should make your stuff for free is not something that we should hit people with at the end of the project. It's something that should be part of the discussions from the beginning. And making it openly available does not mean that the labor should be unfunded or undercompensated in any way. That's part of this. I think too that what Hannah is gesturing towards is an important problem for us to take on, because saying we'll make this openly available for free does not mean that we don't talk about the labor that it takes to make it and how that labor is funded. And so that's a start. That is a start of how I would answer this question. Unfortunately, I do not think that this will solve the thinking of digital humanities in this more collective way will solve our problems that push us towards exploitative labor. What I hope, though, is that they will help us work towards being more explicit about labor and scope, and that will help to contribute towards more supportive, less exploitative frameworks.
So Paige, are you okay with answering a couple more questions since we're already?
Totally.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in on David Mazzella's question. So considering what you mentioned earlier in your talk, your call to us to not just create more technology, create more and more projects, but try to engage with them and create new forms and directions of knowledge. What kind of infrastructure do you think people need to navigate this? Or what kind of workflows do you suggest? And I think that this is important, especially considering the previous question of labor, like how does that get involved in, or how does it connect to the workflow in not reproducing the same thing over and over?
Right. So it's a really good question. The biggest piece of formal infrastructure, though I promise you this is not just a giant commercial for the Humanities Commons, the biggest piece of formal infrastructure that exists are sites like Humanities Commons, Dataverse, Figshare, places where these are stored. And I think that I can't poll you all, obviously I can't see you, but I think that actually a really important first key step in starting to engage with this and tunnel through it is actually to ask yourself, how often do I go looking for digital humanities projects? Just to see what's out there. And how do I do that? This almost often brings up the question of, oh, could we have a search engine just for digital humanities projects? Could we have some sort of massive index? Go read Quinn's article on whatever happened to Project Bamboo. Though that's talking about tools, it's a good lesson. Unfortunately, there is not at any point in the future going to be one place for it. But my experience in working with people is that when I often say to them, so how often do you go looking to see what digital humanities projects might be out there? I frequently meet people who say, I'm not even sure how to do that. To some degree, you can do this by Googling, and indeed, the workshop that I did for y'all back in November, December last year, in part went into some of those techniques. There are lots of different ways, but I think that making time to just look for projects in itself is a really good first step. And a really small and manageable first step that we often don't train people, we don't encourage people to do. We encourage them to think about what to build.
So I'm gonna finish up with the last two questions. This one is from Lee Lieberman, and she wants to know about your thoughts on the role of formal standards such as linked open data and how what role they can play in the humanities toward achieving the sense of connectivity and collectivity.
Oh boy, thinking about linked open data is one of my favorite topics. I am not going to go down the full rabbit hole that I could with this, though Lee and anyone else who wants to talk linked data, hit me up on Twitter. I'm happy to talk more about that. I think that linked open data, which I would summarize as wanting to create this sort of infrastructure of controlled vocabularies and terms and reference pages for all sorts of projects, all sorts of digital projects is a really fascinating direction of technology. You could think about it as though, well, trying to think about how best to describe it. Imagine the idea of Wikipedia for all humanities topics. If you had that sort of structure with categories and subcategories, et cetera. People build linked open data vocabularies focusing on specialized topics. The challenge, if you're working with linked open data, is always, man, do I go with a more general vocabulary or standard that sort of works with my topic, or do I build a more specific one? There is good potential for linked open data. The challenge, though, is also that we really often want to make linked open data work for everything. And so I've pasted into the chat one of my favorite XKCD cartoons that is about competing standards. And this is a challenge for linked open data as well as anything else. And I'm going to nip that question right off there. Happy to talk about it more in another space.
All right, last one. This question, I just saw it a second ago, is from Catherine Nicole Coleman, and she asks, following up on Hannah's comment, what do you think is the role of publishers in digital projects? So, you know, the peer reviewed and any other digital publishing.
Oh, that is such an exciting question. And I will once again gesture with applause towards Jen Gugliano's and Ripika Rizam's reviews in DH, because I think that one thing that publishers can do is think about ways of promoting this engagement, which could be in the form of building a new DH project, but could also be in the form of exploring with and reviewing DH projects. This does not necessarily involve hosting complex Flash code on your page. I think too that it would be exciting for publishers to think about what kinds of artifacts or components of projects could we publish and make a habit of publishing. But I say this and I realize that I'm blurring the line between publishers and people who are providing publishing infrastructure, i.e. a setup for other folks to publish a journal. I also want to note that being successful as a publisher means finding a particular niche and building on it, and that there are lots of directions that could go in. There isn't a simple direction that works for all publishers.
Thank you so much, Paige.
You're so welcome.
Everybody, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. This talk is recorded and is available on our YouTube channel, so please follow us on social media. Just a quick reminder that the CFP for ACH 2021, which will be virtual, is now available. It's in the chat, as is the link for the US Latino Digital Humanities Grants and Aid. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Right.
Gracias. Adios.
Thank you all. It was so lovely getting to spend this hour with you. Thank you for listening and engaging with me.